It's time to start. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Ryan Korstange. I'm a Director of Academic Affairs here at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. So thank you for taking your time here with us today. I know that time is precious, but it's such an exciting opportunity to come to Open Education Week and to hear about all the great things that are happening with open education in Tennessee and beyond. As you know, Open Education Week is an annual celebration. It's put together by OE Global. And I'm going to put a link into the chat. Well, I'm going to put several links into the chat, but the first link in the chat is a link to OE Global's OE Week schedule of events. There's tons of stuff on there, and it's certainly worth your time to look at those events. Many of them are available even after this week, and so please take advantage of those if they interest you. THEC here, what we're about is we're focused on increasing the number of Tennesseans who have a post-secondary credential. And we understand that costs of attendance and costs of textbooks both provide significant barriers to students. And what's more than that, we understand that the way that educational materials are used in class contributes to learning, contributes to persistence, and contributes to graduation rates. And so we're interested in all of the innovative efforts that center students in instruction and that put students on a path to success. We have 10 events this week. It's obviously Thursday. 4 more remain. We're hosting webinars at 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. every day this week. All of these webinars will be recorded and we'll distribute them afterwards next week sometime. You can stay up to date with what's happening in Tennessee around open education in 2 ways. You can join our listserv. It's our textbook affordability listserv. You can email academic.programs@tn.gov and we'll get you set up with the listserv. Or you can join our Tennessee Open Education Hub. It's an OER Commons hub. And I've posted a link to the chat with information as to how to join. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to join the Tennessee Open Education group, which is where we share information about sort of what's happening in Tennessee. And you feel free to join other groups that are in there as well. One more piece of logistics. We're hosting this as a webinar. We have disabled the Q&A feature. We'd just like to centralize everything into the chat. So please, as you have questions, as this presentation goes on, just jump into the chat with the questions that you have. We'll monitor the chat and there'll be time at the end of the presentation to handle questions. With that, I'm going to turn things over to the presenters. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Using Open Educational Practices to Create Equity-Minded Instruction. My name is Robert Denn. I'm your host for this presentation, and I serve as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the Tennessee Board of Regents. And I'm joined today by Richard Sebastian from Achieving the Dream and Rebecca Griffiths and Ela Joshi from SRI Education. A little bit about those organizations. Achieving the Dream is a nonprofit organization based in DC metro area and is leading the most comprehensive non-governmental reform movement for student success in higher education. Together with a network of over 300 institutions of higher ed, 75 coaches and advisors, ATD is helping millions of community college students have a better chance of realizing greater economic opportunity and achieving their dreams. And as part of ATD's teaching and learning team, Richard leads grant-funded initiatives and develops services that help colleges build capacity in open education and digital learning. Nonprofit Research and Development Institute. Ela and Rebecca work in SRI's Education Division, which conducts research and develops tools and resources that improve teaching and accelerate and deepen learning for students of all ages. And the Tennessee Board of Regents governs the largest public higher education system in Tennessee, comprising 39 community and technical colleges, serving 140,000 students annually. Today, you will learn about, on this session, you will learn about the OER grant program, culturally responsive educational practices, and about an ATD SRI TBR collaboration on a system-wide research project measuring the impact of open educational practices on student learning. And we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. And the slide deck will be made available to you by the OE Week sponsors, Ryan and his team at THEC. So if you'll advance the slide for me, please, Ryan. And one more if you don't mind. So a little bit about the grant program administered by TBR, the OER grant program. It is a component of our statewide enterprise called Tennessee Open Education. And it is funded with access and diversity monies administered by TBR. And you can read there the primary purpose of the OER grant program is to increase equity and access to quality, no low-cost educational materials. So the eligible institutions to apply for this particular grant are the 6 public LGIs in Tennessee, and of course the TBR community and technical colleges. And their teams, we're encouraging teams of at least 2 with faculty, librarians, instructional designers, other support staff involved in OER to apply. And the applications are due 8 days from now, March 18th. And there are 3 different tiers in which you can apply. And you can see those there. And we'll give you some more information about that and some documents that we'll post later. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. So we're in our 3rd year. We're in cycle 3 now. That's the application that's due here on the 18th. In the first 2 years, you can see the numbers. We're growing in the interest for applicants, and we've awarded a total of about 800,000 so far. And the impact, which is really impressive for just those 2 cycle projects, have saved students over the past 2 years of almost $7 million. So that's a little bit about the TBR OER grant program. And now I will turn it over to Rebecca, Richard, and Ela to talk more about open educational practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. My name is Richard Sebastian. Again, I'm with Achieving the Dream. And before we move on, I just want to get do a kind of quick poll of the folks who are here with us today. And if you could use at the bottom of your screen, there's a little raise hand button, which we might need. And also, we're going to be using the chat feature. And we're going to be talking today, obviously it's Open Ed Week, so we're going to talk about OER and something called open educational practices or open pedagogy. And if you could, in the chat, using a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being you don't have much experience and 5, you have a lot of experience, tell us your level of experience with open pedagogy or open educational practices. So 1 is low, 5 is high. A few more seconds. Okay, we got a mix of folks, some more experience and some new. Great. Let's do the same thing, except with a second concept we're going to talk about today, which is culturally relevant or culturally responsive teaching practices. If you could put a score in the chat, 1 being low and 5 being high with your experience. 1, you may not even know what it is, and 5, you're fairly expert at it. Okay, so a little less experience with that from you guys. Great. And if you could, I'm assuming most people here are from the state of Tennessee. So if you are, if you could put what institution you're associated with, or if you're outside of Tennessee, let us know that too. So if you could tell us which college or Tennessee Board of Regents. Yeah. I got some Middle Tennessee State, Jackson, and TBR. Columbia State. Great. Great. Well, appreciate you guys chiming in there. It's helpful to know who's with us today. If you could advance the slide, Ryan. One more. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about these two concepts of open educational practices, or OEP is the acronym, right? Or culture responsive educational practices, or CRE practices, and how these things intersect to create equity-minded instruction and focus on equity. And we're really talking about this in the context of a kind of arc of research and implementation between Achieving the Dream and SRI over the years on kind of getting to the point of asking this question about creating equity-minded instruction in this way in the classroom. So how do you use OER? How do you use open educational resources using evidence-based teaching practices? And what are the impacts? So a little bit, if we go forward one slide, please. So equity-minded instruction is based on this kind of concept of equity-mindedness, which comes out of the USC Center for Urban Education. And it really is a perspective or mode of thinking exhibited by practitioners, so faculty or whoever is part of the educational enterprise, who call attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. And they're willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of their students and critically reassess their own practices. And looking at, are the practices I engage in, how do they contribute to this persistent equity gap, if they do, and what are some ways or some strategies I can use in order to address this? And so kind of an overlap with this is culturally responsive teaching, which is a strategy faculty can engage in order to become more equity minded and create this kind of instruction. And Rebecca's going to talk to you a little bit about specifically what we say is culturally responsive teaching.
Thanks, Richard. So one way to think about culturally responsive education is that this is a set of educational practices that seek to embed students' cultures deeply into the processes and structures of learning, and that also view the classroom as a site for social change. But I want to acknowledge that there is no one definition of culturally responsive education. This is there is a long history of scholarship around a set of sort of overlapping and interwoven bodies of thought, sometimes referred to as culturally responsive education, culturally relevant teaching, culturally sustaining education. Many important scholars have contributed to this. And in our work, we're using culturally responsive education as a way to kind of operationalize some of the equity-minded principles that Richard just described as we've been exploring ways that open education and open educational resources can support more equity-oriented instructional practices. So some of the themes that we have sort of gleaned from this body of literature are things like allowing students or empowering students with voice and agency over their learning, selecting course topics and instructional materials that are relevant for students, that draw from their backgrounds, creating an inclusive classroom experience. So in a minute, my colleague Ela is going to talk more about some of the specific themes that we have gleaned from this body of literature and embedded into our work. But I think the important point here is that there's a lot of overlap with culturally responsive education, and some of the sort of critical values and practices of open education. And so we've been thinking about how to look at these intersections and the ways that open educational resources can support use of culturally responsive educational practices. Next, it's back to Richard.
Thanks, Rebecca. So what do we talk about and some of you are new to this, obviously, from your responses in the chat, when we talk about open educational practices. And again, similar to culturally responsive teaching practices or culturally relevant teaching practices, these concepts. Same with open educational practices. It's not there's a lot of different kind of angles on kind of how to define these practices or open pedagogy. And but how we're thinking about it today and talking about it today is really what are the practices that you can use that use the affordances of OER, and that's the affordance of OER are really that open licensing piece, right? The licenses that allow you to do something different with this content than you can with copyrighted materials that don't have a license, right? So the CC BY license or the non-commercial license, and the combination of these different Creative Commons licenses that give you permission to edit the content, revise it, share it. It's really the superpower of OER, and so these practices use that licensing and the affordances that come with them to empower learners, to make them co-producers of knowledge, to value and incorporate their backgrounds and perspectives, to address their needs. So it really facilitates, as you'll see, not only this kind of concept of open pedagogy, but kind of other evidence-based practices that we know are really kind of powerful ways to learn. And next slide, please. And what's really important here is these questions about these concepts of open pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching, and where they intersect, has evolved, as our partnership, meaning ATD and SRI, has evolved over the years. Rebecca's going to talk a little bit about how we got started, but I think it's really important that the questions that we're asking now, we're going to talk a little bit about our current study with Tennessee, have evolved over the years in this partnership, and kind of almost an arc of kind of research and questions that we've been asking, starting with kind of institutional questions about implementing OER to now focusing in on specific classroom practices that faculty can employ, and what are those outcomes on individual students. And so it's been a really beneficial partnership, I think, and Achieving the Dream has really benefited from deeper understanding of OER and open pedagogy and these culturally relevant teaching practices, which we've begun to kind of integrate as a kind of a central component of our teaching and learning work with our colleges. But Rebecca's going to talk about where we got started with the OER degree initiative. Rebecca.
Thank you. Next, Ryan, we could go forward. So we started big. We started our partnership with a research and evaluation of an initiative that ATD led called the OER Degree Initiative, which worked with 38 community colleges across the country to launch OER degree pathways, which were intended to be entire pathways of OER courses that students could, in theory, take to achieve a degree without paying anything for instructional material costs. And this provided a really exceptional opportunity for us to conduct research on what OER implemented at scale could look like from an institutional perspective and from an instructor perspective, and how that impacted students, especially when they had the opportunity to take multiple OER courses that were designed not just as one-off OER courses undertaken through the heroic labor of individual faculty, but as part of a kind of coherent institutional effort. So in total, we had around 2,000 instructors involved, 38 colleges, 160,000 students were impacted by these courses. And in a nutshell, what we found was that the opportunity to enroll in multiple OER courses led to academic gains for students, and that they accumulated more credits towards their degrees over time. They certainly saved money on textbook costs by enrolling in those courses. We found some evidence that instructors change their teaching philosophies and practices. In a cost analysis that was focused on the institutional impacts, we actually found that some colleges recouped their investments in launching these programs in the form of increased tuition revenues from students enrolling in more classes with the money they saved on textbooks or just the experience they had in those courses. So we saw a lot of promising results come out of that program. And the end of it, having taken this, gone big to start out with, we then felt a desire to have more insight into what was happening on a smaller scale. So we wanted to get more insight into what was happening within the classrooms and really delve into that question about how instructors were, or to what extent instructors were changing teaching philosophies and practices. So we go to the next slide. That leads me to our current study, which is a deeper examination of how faculty are using the affordances of OER to enact more open and culturally responsive teaching practices. This study is still underway. We are putting the finishing touches on our final report, and we'll be sharing that at an upcoming teaching institute that Achieving the Dream will host in April. But I can share just a little bit of what we've learned. We worked with 8 community colleges and conducted interviews with faculty, students, some course observations. Unfortunately, this was pretty much all online, so it wasn't, we weren't able to observe what these practices might look like in an in-person setting. But we did find faculty making some really exciting changes to their instructional practices, often using more inclusive content, increasing student voice and choice in their assignments, creating more opportunities for students to generate knowledge. We have, out of this work, developed a framework that Ela's going to talk about, share a little more about, which attempts to capture dimensions of open and culturally responsive instructional practices. And we also found that the implementation of these practices was not very consistent. And even though these colleges had pretty robust programs in most cases to support open education resources, they were not nearly as far along in terms of thinking about how to support open education practices. So let's go to the next slide. And I will hand the floor over to Ela.
Thank you. So as Rebecca mentioned, a key outcome of the study was the development of a framework capturing how open and culturally responsive practices may be enacted across different components of a course. So the creation of this framework was iterative. We developed a first iteration using a review of literature on open educational practices and culturally responsive educational practices. And we paired this with emerging themes from interviews with open educational practice experts and practitioners from fall 2020. And then we continued to refine this framework using data from our spring 2021 site visits that Rebecca mentioned. So we are really excited and happy to share with you today the current version of the framework for enacting open and culturally responsive practices. You can see an image of the full framework on the slide, and on the next couple of slides, we're just going to highlight a few of the key elements. Thank you. So the framework identifies 5 dimensions that are associated with open and culturally responsive practices stemming from prior literature, as well as practitioner and expert experiences from the field. The first dimension here is student agency and ownership, where students just have more voice, choice, or leadership over their learning. Second is the use of more inclusive content. So the course may include, diverse perspectives and may tailor content to student needs and interests. The third dimension is knowledge generation, where the course may have opportunities for students to collaboratively apply, evaluate, or even create new knowledge. The fourth is critical consciousness, where the course aims to develop students' critical consciousness around social justice issues. And finally, the classroom culture. So there's a strong culture and relationships between students and between students and the instructor, as well as a safe space. So we examined these 5 dimensions across 5 course components. breaking down essentially what each of these 5 dimensions would look like with respect to the course design, the course materials, practices, what they would look like with respect to assignments and assessments, as well as interpersonal interactions. So, our sort of takeaway in going through the process of developing this framework is that open educational practices and culturally responsive educational practices are ultimately meant to be a sort of integrated system of practices as opposed to one-off activities. But it can be incredibly daunting to convert a course to OER materials and try and do all these practices at the same time. So we hope that this framework will make these practices a little bit more approachable by providing some concrete ideas of places to start. And so to this end, we hope that the framework can serve as a useful tool to help zoom in on specific practices and break them down into more manageable pieces. So I'm going to turn it over now to Richard, who's going to share some examples of what each of these dimensions can look like.
Great. So, if we put these kind of concepts in the kind of yellow of these dimensions that Ela talked about and combine them with these course components, course design, interactions, assessments, et cetera, we come up with kind of this, like Ela said, a way of kind of operationalizing these practices with kind of specific, instructional moves that you can make in your classroom if you're a faculty member. So if you could click on the graphic, Ryan. So, what does this look like when you combine, classroom culture and course design? All right, but it's, again, these are integrated ideas, but in this specific, example, the instructor plans course activities to build collaborative, welcoming, and open class culture. So one example of that, go ahead and click. This is something, it's actually out of Stanford, and it's a program called What I Wish My Professor Knew. And it's with students who are first generation, sometimes first generation students of color, give feedback or provide perspectives to their faculty about their experiences or about ways that they either have felt welcomed as students that sometimes are don't have the resources that other students do, or their backgrounds are such that they kind of need some more guidance to have a successful college career. They're first generation students. They haven't really kind of learned how to be students. And they provide kind of really constructive examples and the impacts on them of when that doesn't happen and how it makes them feel. And so this is a important concept of thinking about how the course is not just something students come in and they sit down and you teach the content, but you really need to intentionally design a kind of welcoming and safer space for students. Next slide. And click. So another example is this idea of student agency. And how does this intersect with your instructional materials if you're a faculty? Well, that students are allowed to choose, edit, or create instructional materials in class. They get to participate in the creation of these materials. It's a really powerful approach. So one example of this on the next slide comes out of this most recent study that we're just finishing from Houston Community College, and it's James Ross Nazal's history class, a U.S. history class. He uses a OER textbook in his class, but he also has this ancillary kind of companion textbook or text that the students author. So they take concepts in whatever the topic they're studying and choose an aspect or research an aspect and do a piece that is included after he kind of reviews it and edits it, right, and does some review of it, and becomes part of this ancillary textbook. Next slide. So, for example, during Interwar America chapter that they were studying, the students developed a piece on early serial killers during this time, before we had that term, right, for these types of folks. Or in another chapter on the next slide, during the kind of 70s pop culture, the students got together and did a chapter on blaxploitation, disco, and martial arts. So kind of really fascinating, got a combination of things to sum up the 70s culture. So, so that's really, again, another powerful example of using these practices in an open way at this intersection of these concepts. Next slide. We also have inclusive content and instructional materials, right? So the course materials include topics that are relatable to the students and their communities. Example of that on the next slide comes out of the Montgomery College, and they have a really incredible program called the UN SDG Fellowship. That's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Fellowship that they designed a number of years ago that among other things, faculty, interdisciplinary faculty get together and create open assignments. So they're openly licensed. And their assignments around one of these sustainable development goals. So, addressing, quality education, addressing climate change or poverty. And the students, take on these assignments, which involve some kind of real world application. So many of the students' assignments that they do are, designed to benefit their communities or designed to be kind of actionable. And they're also openly licensed, right? So they can be used. And so it's really, if you're a student, and used to what we refer to as disposable assignments that you just kind of do, you get a grade and that's it. But instead you have these assignments that have, or that could potentially make an impact on your community, or it could be, something that's shared outside of your community and repurposed in another community. Next slide. So with this kind of example of this framework, as we're kind of starting to think about what it looks like in practice and how you operationalize it in the classroom, we've our next kind of piece of this investigation of these concepts and what they how they impact students is a partnership here with Tennessee, where we're looking at this OER grant program that's now in its third year and kind of adding an additional element to it that looks at these practices in ways that we can support them through professional development and also what they look like in the classroom when they're implemented with these OER grantees. So again, this is designed around the OER grant program, whose RFP is out now. And there's an extra tier of participation. So there's tier 1, which is just like it's been for the past couple of years, where you create an OER course and then teach it in your course. The second level is the participation in the study, which you also, in addition to developing your OER course, participate in deploying or implementing kind of a set of these practices in your classroom and being part of the study and evaluation of what those look like, how they work, how the students feel about them, which is the piece that SRI is leading. So it includes professional development from ATD and support, and then the data and evaluation piece. And Rebecca can talk a little bit about the study design here.
Actually, Richard, I'll hop in about the study design really quickly. So as you said, that the study aims to really understand how design teams that are participating in Tier 2 experience PD on open educational practices and culturally responsive educational practices, how they redesign courses in the fall of 2022 to incorporate these practices, how they implement these courses in spring 2023, and how students are experiencing these courses. To that end, from around summer 2022 through spring 2023, we're hoping that Tier 2 grantees will participate in a few low-lift data collection activities, potentially including surveys, implementation logs, and interviews, as well as helping us coordinate a few student focus groups. In total, we estimate that these activities will take about 10 hours over the course of the school year. So hopefully very low lift and at the same time, very informative. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk a little bit about what we're hoping to learn from the study.
Thank you, Ela. I think maybe I'll refer back to the arc that Richard described, which was that we started out by kind of examining what OER programs implemented at scale in institutions would look like and how those could impact students. We then delved into the classroom to understand more about how use of OER could lead to transformative teaching practices and more equity-oriented or equity-minded instruction. Saw a lot of variation and not a lot of institutional supports for those practices. So now we are turning our attention to how a state-led effort can support a more perhaps consistent, coherent, intentional approach to using OER as part of an effort to reinvigorate or transform instructional practices to accomplish some of the things that those dimensions that Ela talked about and Richard talked about, to give students more agency and voice, to make the design courses that are more reflective of the students who are teaching them and more relevant, and potentially that also prompt students to bring a more critical, conscious perspective to their coursework. So in this next step, we're again kind of looking towards how institutional supports and a state-led effort can help faculty to enact these kinds of practices, because we recognize this is an enormous amount of work, and people, it's very hard for individual faculty members to figure out what this looks like independently, and that there could be a lot of benefit from doing this in a more coherent way with more support.
And I should say, and I forgot to mention, and in this kind of second tier of participation, we've also included past grantees are eligible to apply, and again that depending on how many and who applies for that particular tier, helps us maybe see a difference between faculty who've taught a course maybe several semesters, right, and have some experience with it, and if there's a difference in the challenge or how they kind of integrate these practices in the classroom. So that's going to be another interesting aspect of this study, which I should also say is a proposed study. We're still waiting to hear from our funder. We're pretty confident, but again, it's not totally official yet. Anyway, so that's kind of our presentation today, but we do have and would love to hear your questions that you have for us. And I believe if you could enter them into the chat, we'd be happy to spend some time answering them.
Let me start with one question as people are sort of thinking through. I think that when we start to include open educational practices into the conversation and culturally responsive teaching, we get to this point of like a shift in thinking around what open provides. So when we focus on open educational resources, it's easy to think about open contributing to a product, right? Like a textbook replacement that's at the end of the line. When we move into more of this pedagogy focus, we're thinking about open as a process a little bit more, or open as an approach, or open as a pedagogy. So for faculty members who are sort of thinking about including some of these more process-oriented parts in their teaching, how would you recommend that they sort of get started and begin to make that transition? Because as you've mentioned, there's a lot going on and it can get really easy to feel overwhelmed. So are there some like practical inroads that you can kind of cast and envision for us?
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll let Rebecca and Ela chime in. You're exactly right, and I think it's likened it to other kind of innovations, right? That it takes us a while to figure out what we have here. What are the affordances of this thing, and where are the benefits? And so one approach is OER is like a textbook replacement. It's free, but there's not really a shift in the approach. But we think that's well, first of all, that's great. If you just do that, I think that's really beneficial to students. But there's another opportunity to think about using OER in a classroom in a specific way that help you engage in these practices. And I think first, what I would say is to kind of keep this in context that we think that institutions should support this. Like we're not asking faculty just to kind of engage in this on their own without some institutional support. So that really, it's kind of the findings that came out of this current study was that there needs to be some more structure and support to help faculty think about their classroom practice and get the kind of training and other support from their institution. And I also think that it's similar to what I've seen with like OER implementation. Like start small, like start with something manageable from this framework, because the framework kind of includes other examples from the field and practice that faculty have engaged in, that they can start and kind of bite off a really manageable piece to maybe try and then continue to build on. And then I'll let Rebecca or Ela chime in if they want.
So just to build on what Richard said, I think, so one very manageable first step could be an assignment instead of a, as Richard described, a disposable assignment, like having your students write a term paper, which they're going to then toss into the garbage can when the term is over. Think of a project that applies the concepts and the skills that are being taught in the class to some kind of real world, maybe local community issue. I mean, it really will depend on the type of course and what the discipline is, but I think in most disciplines, it's possible to think of an application to a problem in the community, and students might work on thinking about how they would apply these concepts to a real world situation individually. They could do this as part of group work, and then they can create some kind of a group product that could be published with a CC license on the web. That doesn't, that's not necessary. I think some people have different feelings about the privacy considerations for students, but I think the idea that giving students that sense that they can create knowledge that has value to the world, and that they can apply these problems, these concepts they're learning in school to real world problems, it can be very empowering. One other thing I'll just share from our findings from this past study was that just tossing out the commercial textbook can be a really valuable first step. We heard from a number of faculty how being liberated from the textbook and not feeling like they had to wade through all of the content, all of the topics that the textbook covered, just opened up a lot of space for instructors to have more, have more agency over what they were teaching, and opened up space for students to contribute more and to have more voice in the direction the course took. So that could be another useful first step.
Okay, so Robert wanted to share a PDF, and so I think we're going to share that. Robert, do you want to tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, we've mentioned the tiers a couple of times for the OER grant cycle 3. And this, I believe this, Ryan, this graphic is on the hub. Is that correct? Is it linked from the hub already? But the different tiers, a tier 1 is for faculty who want to develop their own OER materials to use in their class in the spring. And that's the most basic level, and there's money to fund that. And the tier 2 that you heard Richard talk about is where you would do that in addition to participate in some professional development and be a part of the research study that SRI and ATD are running as integrated in this grant program. And then, of course, the tier, what we're calling tier 2B, is for previous grant recipients from cycle 1 and cycle 2 who they received funding, they already developed the materials, they've been running the course, but they also, if they're interested in being part of the OEP study, they can do that as well. That's tier 2B. I just wanted to make sure that folks attending the session understood about what those tiers meant. And you'll select when you go into the grant RFP portal. It's also linked from the hub. You'll be able to select which tier for which tier you are applying. Thank you very much.
Okay, there's one question in the chat about the difference between open education pedagogy and open education practice, if those are different concepts or interchangeable.
Ela, you want to take this? Well, I can give a very short answer, which is I wouldn't say they're quite interchangeable. Some people may use them that way. I think of practices as encompassing different components of a course beyond the pedagogy. So it's the course design, the instructional materials, the instructional practices, where I think there's the most overlap with pedagogy. It could be the classroom culture and environment that an instructor facilitates, and the kinds of interactions they or dynamic they establish between students. So pedagogy is obviously a really important part of that, maybe the most important part, but I do think there are other practices that go beyond pedagogy.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that excellent definition, I think, to distinguish the two is the connection to materials. I think practices really try and capture how OER materials may facilitate these practices.
Well, great. I don't see any other questions right now in the chat. If you do have a question, feel free to drop it in there. But as you know, last call, I guess, for questions. But let me just thank the presenters today. This has been really interesting. It's really interesting to think about the connection between open and teaching, and open and student-focused and student-centered work, and to move us past just producing resources that replace traditional textbooks, and think about how those are used in class in a more deep way. That's really interesting. And so we certainly appreciate your time today and getting us to think in those directions. Yeah, with that, I think that we are in a good spot. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.